Okay, thanks everybody. I'd like to thank David Jones for organising our guest speaker today. Our guest speaker, if you've not met him already this morning, is Barry Blake, sitting opposite David over there. And his presentation today, Barry's a linguist and specialising in Australian Aboriginal languages. He's also an Emeritus Professor at Latrobe University. I understand he'll have a PowerPoint presentation this morning. And we welcome you, Barry. Looking forward to your presentation this morning. So without further, welcome you to the microphone.
Better microphone. You just clip this onto your. You can just clip it on it. Clip it onto your shirt if that's okay. That's okay. And you just stay here. Right, and you've got to get back to the beginning here. Okay. Yep, I might need a glass of water. Can I just get a glass of water?
Can we get a glass of water for Barry?
Just someone grab a glass of water.
Glass of water.
Glass of water.
And can you turn the main lights off, Colin? And we've got a light up here which will shine out. It'll also match.
Yep. Good. I'll just wait till I get a glass of water. You can just put it there, can I?
You can?
Yes, there's no level surface there.
Can I just use it for a minute?
Sure, that's wine. Water.
Members, he's not putting it in, and that's a microphone.
Good, thank you. Yeah, we're right, aren't we? Good. Okay, I think we're right. We might begin. Let's go to the first slide. So, with the previous talk, we had mention of this, that about 60,000 years ago, human... Want to speak loud, more louder?
My job at the back is to make sure we can hear.
All right, okay.
If you can.
All right. So about 60,000 years ago, people began arriving in this part of the world. I hesitate to say Australia, because as you can see from that map, they came to a landmass, Sahul, which consisted of the Australian mainland, somewhat enlarged, taking in Tasmania, and of course taking in New Guinea. Over a period of time, the sea level rises and falls, and about 60,000 years ago, the sea level was comparatively low, and it was relatively easy to get to Australia through Indonesia with short sea voyages. The sea level, there was another ice age about 18,000 years ago, and at that time Australia would not have been fully inhabited, although the people might have spread over the whole continent initially. During that period, the inland part of Australia was abandoned and then resettled. It's not certain how many people came or exactly when they came, but it's highly likely that people came not just in one particular period, but maybe there could have been over a period of some thousands of years people were coming. And the whole continent was occupied by 35,000 years ago, and as I mentioned a minute ago, the interior of the continent became uninhabitable at one stage. Now, Tasmania was separated from the mainland about 12,000 years ago, and New Guinea about 10,000 years ago. The dingo was introduced about 5,000 years ago, and as you can see from that, there are no dingoes in Tasmania. Fishermen from Indonesia, they're known as Macassans, but they didn't necessarily come from Macassar, were active along the northern coast of Australia, particularly in Arnhem Land, from the 18th to the 20th century. They came to fish beche de mer, sea cucumber. So there's very little outside contact with the rest of the world. We don't know who brought the dingo, and the people from Indonesia didn't have any lasting effect, although also contact from New Guinea in across Torres Strait did mean the introduction of new technologies such as bows and arrows. So there you can see the same information again, with Australia and New Guinea joined 40,000 years ago, then Tasmania splitting off 12,000 years ago, and New Guinea 10,000 years ago. The Aborigines have long memories. In 1858, an Aborigine named Murray was standing at Williamstown looking out across the bay, and he said to a white fellow, he said, we used to hunt out there looking down the bay, he said, and that channel that the ships used to come up the bay, that was the Yarra River. And it's now known that that was true. Apparently 1,000 years ago, the heads were silted up, and what is now Port Phillip Bay was dry land traversed by the Yarra River, Werribee River and so on. In South Australia, down in the Mount Gambier area, the people have a story about Cratebull the giant. Now, the craters of volcanoes are thought to be the ovens of giants, and they claim that Cratebull moved his oven from Mount Muirhead near Millicent 20,000 years ago, if I've got the figures right, yes. And then he moved to Mount Shank, which is on the road between Port MacDonnell and Mount Gambier. And then that fire went out, and so he then moved to Mount Gambier. And archaeologists have shown that that is the sequence on which the volcanoes became extinct. Now, when the white fellow came to Australia and took over the country, there were numerous languages, and you can see a pattern there. You can't read the detail there, but you can see the huge number of languages. There are over 700 names, or 800, I've got the word 800, ballpark figure, it doesn't matter one way or the other, a large number of names. If we group the names together, when they share 70% of vocabulary, we get down to a figure of about 250. So 250 completely separate entities, but 800 languages in all. Now, on that point of grouping, there's Victoria, and you can see in Western Victoria, I've written there Western Kulin, which you can possibly read. You probably can't read the smaller labels. So the smaller labels are what Aboriginal people identify with. So there's Chapwarong near Hamilton, Djadjurong near Bendigo, Wergaya in the Wimmera. And if you compare Chapwarong and Djadjurong, you find they have 80% of vocabulary in common, so you can say, well, they're dialects of a single language. You have mutual intelligibility. And then you take Djadjurong and Wemba up near Swan Hill, they've got 80% in common. People could understand one another, dialects of one language. And then you can take Wemba and Lechi up near Mildura, 80%. But the thing is that it's only the neighbours that have the 80%. When you compare Chapwarong and Lechi, you're down to 50%. So it's a little bit unrealistic to say that it's all one language. It's sort of a mega language, and from a linguist's point of view, they're all similar. From an Aboriginal point of view, the differences are such that they wouldn't consider them an entity at all. So Aboriginal people identify with these smaller entities, and there are something like 800 of them. The 250 languages, and that means taking language to mean the groups where, say, going back to that slide, in Western Victoria we group all of those as one language in a certain sense, in the way that I mentioned, but perhaps unrealistically. If we take those 250, then they have completely separate vocabularies, which is a bit annoying. If you learn one language, it doesn't help you much with the other languages. There are pronouns and some verb roots that are common to virtually all the languages, which suggests that these languages are ultimately related, at least the ones of the mainland. The material available on Tasmania is very poor and consists only of word lists, but there are insufficient resemblances between the languages, any language of the mainland and the languages of Tasmania to show that they're related. But given that time depth, cut off 10,000 years ago or more, you wouldn't expect there to be any relationship. And the same with New Guinea. We can't find any relationship between languages of Australia and New Guinea. And then it follows from that there are no relationships between languages of Australia and any other part of the world. Now, I'll talk about different parts of the language. First of all, the sounds, and then the grammar, and then the vocabulary. A strange thing about Australian languages is that the sound systems are much the same over the whole continent. Now, consider the Romance languages, Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, French, Italian, all derived from Latin. So it was one language 2,000 years ago. But consider the sounds of Italian and the sounds of French, and you probably have some familiarity with those. They're completely different. But in Australia, all of these languages, many of which are only remotely related, have exactly the same sound system. So once you've learnt the the pronunciation for one language, it works pretty well for the others. In most languages, the words are of 2 or more syllables and then in a vowel. Think of words like kangaroo, wallaby, corroboree, and place names like Parramatta. The exception is Victoria, where we have names ending, words in fact ending in various consonants. Bunyip, which is the mythical creature, Geelong, a place name of course, and Colac and Warrnambool. Geelong means tongue, Colac means sand, and Warrnambool's interesting. It means having fire, and presumably relates to the volcanoes in the area. And then lerp, which is an exudation from insects you get on plants which you can eat, and bort, which is the place name. So words in Victoria are rather different, but over most of Australia, words are like kangaroo, wallaby, and so on. They're polysyllabic and end in a vowel. Human beings can make... All right, okay. Human beings can make over 100 different speech sounds, and each language chooses certain ones. There are differences, for instance, between American English and our English. For instance, you take the word P-A-W-N and P-O-R-N, Americans pronounce those differently. There used to be a song, "There's a pawn shop in the corner in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania." Do you remember that one? And that, of course, was a P-A-W-N shop. And Americans would make a distinction between P-A-W-N and P-O-R-N, and the same distinction is made in Aboriginal languages between, say, Wunka, life, and Wunka, a creepy crawly. A minister of religion told me once he chose for his sermon, "I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will have eternal life." And when he started speaking, people started sniggering and laughing behind their hands and giving one another funny looks. At the end of his sermon, he said, what happened? They said, "You said Wunka instead of Wunka. You said, believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll have eternal creepy crawlies." One of the features of Australian languages is they have a lot of NG sound at the beginning of words, and people who are not brought up on that have terrible trouble pronouncing it, and even sometimes hearing it. So the town Anarchy, it should be Ngunaki, so it was recorded without the NG. And the man who appears on the $50 note, David Ngunaitpon, it should be, but the NG is lost, and then letter U is a tricky, we'll come up against that, and again, I suppose when you see that, you say David Ngunaitpon, so it's a long way from the original, which is Ngunaitpon. Australian languages don't have fricative sounds like f and any of those. And so when a word is borrowed from English with one of those sounds, it gets converted to a stop sound. So the word sister comes up as tidda. And of course, once people have tidda in their system, they don't necessarily recognise it's from English. And I heard someone interviewed on the ABC the other day, and they said that this was a widespread Aboriginal word for sister, but it's not an Aboriginal word, it's an English word in disguise. And Aboriginal languages don't have a word for sister anyway. They have older sister and older brother, and sometimes younger sister and younger brother, or sometimes just younger sibling. Now, when I was working in Queensland, I came across this word tubu for soap. Well, at least you get suspicious of that word because Aboriginal people didn't have soap. You think about it, soap, so there's no S, it comes out as a th, and the P is okay. There are only 3 vowels in most Australian languages, and the nearest one with soap would be oo, and then you can't have the word ending in the P, so you repeat the vowel, so soap comes out as tubu. And I suppose when that's first borrowed, the people who are converting soap to tubu understand it's soap, but later generations just come across this word tubu and don't see any relationship with soap. And fence, for instance, comes up as pinji. Sometimes the fricative sounds are simply omitted, so school comes up as kula and smoke as muka. Aboriginal languages don't distinguish the pairs PB, TD and KHG. Now linguists, when they write these languages down, they normally standardise on one or the other. So linguists normally only represent those distinctions that matter from the point of view of meaning. So P and B are different in English, pill versus bill, but in an Australian language you can fluctuate between a P sound and a B sound without it affecting the meaning. And this causes some problems, like Walbury is written with P's, T's and K's, but the actual name of the language is pronounced Walbury with a B sound. Same happens with Arrernte. Now, there are 2 traditional spellings, Arrernte with an R, with a T and one with a D, and you see them there, and that's an indication of the fact that you could fluctuate between one or the other. The modern spelling, the 3rd one there, is just a more accurate one, Arrernte. I worked on a language called Kalkadoon. If you go to Mount Isa, you'll see signs around the place with the name Kalkadoon, the 3rd item there. It written in with all the sounds represented would be either Kalkadungu or Golkadungu, and the problem is with reference works it can be hard sometimes to find a language in a reference work because it could be spelt with one letter or the other. Now moving on to the grammar of Australian languages is remarkably like the grammar of Latin. You have a case system where nouns have inflections to indicate things like the object or the direction, and there are also endings on verbs for first person, second person and so on. So in Taungurung, which is the language of the Goulburn Valley, and is very similar to Woiwurrung, the language of the Melbourne area, they're just dialects of the same language, to say the woman went from Bort to Geelong, Budji Yanai Bodu Gelangda. So Budjo is woman, Yanai is go in the past tense. The root yan for go is one of the pan-Australian roots. You find that all over Australia. Bort, you can see there, but spelt in the system. I'll come in a minute to talk about the way we do have the spelling conventions. And then Geelong with a suffix on the end. So Bort has the suffix u for from, and Geelong has the suffix da for to. Then to say the woman caught a fish with a net, Bangai Bajra Wirab Nandama. Bangai is catch in the past tense, Bajur is woman, and you have a suffix on the end to indicate that she's the one performing the action. Wirab is fish, and Nandama also has a suffix, the same suffix, to indicate the instrument that was used to perform the action. Note the word order. You can have different word orders. In fact, in most Australian languages, the word order is free. There are very few grammatical rules for word order. You can adjust the words to suit your meaning, putting what you want to emphasise first. And in the Victorian materials, there are a lot of examples of the verb first, so we're not certain whether there was complete freedom or perhaps the basic order was just to have the verb first. There's an example of how the grammar looks. There's the word for kangaroo, maram, and then, as I mentioned before, you have a suffix a, marama, to indicate that the person is, or animal is acting. So marama, by the kangaroo, maramal, of the kangaroo, maramdui, with the kangaroo, maramda, to the kangaroo, and maramu, from the kangaroo. If you're familiar with Latin or French or Italian, you'll remember that the verbs have endings for first person, second person and third person. Well, Australian languages have those forms too, so there's the verb to hit, in the present tense, jalbanan, jalbunar, jalbun, and then different forms for the past tense, different forms for the future. And there is a dual as well as plural. So in English we have singular and plural. Once upon a time, in the days of King Alfred, we had dual as well. So Australian languages in general have dual forms, and they also make a distinction between inclusive and exclusive. And we talked about Indonesian before. We have kita and kami, for instance, in Indonesia for inclusive and exclusive. There's an example from Deary in South Australia. So you have 4 ways of saying we. You have dual and plural, and then inclusive and exclusive, where inclusive means including you, exclusive means excluding you. Yep. Okay, now moving on to the vocabulary. As I mentioned before, apart from a score or so of words, which is very widespread, the vocabulary of languages varies a lot from one to the next. But there are a few interesting things, a few interesting features. For instance, the same word is used for skin, peel and bark. And when you think about it, the peel of, say, an orange or something like that is analogous to the skin, and the bark of a tree is analogous to the skin. And so in Arrernte you have yenba, which is, my pictures are meant to indicate skin, and then a fruit. I think that's a paddy melon, I think. And the word paddy melon is confusing because there's a paddy melon, a marsupial, and there's paddy melon, a little melon thing that grows on in a straggly sort of plant along the ground. And then in Nganyajara, the Western Desert language, or a dialect of the Western Desert language, which is spoken in the southern part of the Northern Territory and into Western Australia and South Australia, and you have the word Minyara. The same word is used for arm, front paw, wing and branch. And once again you can see the analogy that the paw of a dog, for instance a dingo, is analogous to the arm of a human being, and to the wing of a bird, the branch of a tree. So those pictures are meant to illustrate the arm, the paw, the wing of a bird, and the branch of a tree. And in the Kulin languages of Victoria, we have words like tarak, tachak and jarak. And that's actually the same word, but there are different forms in different dialects. Now this is one of the most interesting ones. It took me a while to get onto this. Look at the pictures of the hands and look at the words above there, and you see Puchi Manya is the front of the hand and Wart Manya the back of the hand. Nothing to comment on there. But when it comes to the feet, you can see what the front of the foot is. It's the underside is the front of the foot, and the metatarsal area there is the back of the foot. But when you think about it, it makes sense anatomically, doesn't it? Think of where the nails are, okay? I had trouble getting onto that because in the 19th century, the instep, if you look up the Oxford Dictionary, the instep is the part of the metatarsal area, the curve down from the shin to the toes. Whereas for us nowadays, the instep is the underside of the foot. So it took me a while to get onto that because of the English materials. The thumb is considered the mother of the hand, and the big toe the mother of the foot. And I've got different languages there. You could go around Australia and find numerous languages, numerous examples of that. So the common way of looking at the thumb and the big toe, and of course there's an analogy once again anatomically, isn't there, between the thumb and the big toe. One corresponds to the other. Now this is an interesting one too. The same word is used for the hip, the eyebrow and the moon in some languages. I can't say that this is general. And when I first came across that Tanyuk, the hip and eyebrow and moon, I just thought it was a coincidence. But then I discovered in another language the same word was used. Taruk in the Gunjmara language of the Warrnambool area was used for the same. So what do they have in common? Well, I guess it's the curve. It's like the Latin word sinus, S-I-N-U-S, which we know as sinus, the anatomical term, and then so think of a sine wave. So in Latin, sinus means a bay or inlet or bosom or lap. And so it's the curve that's the common thing. And I suppose that's the common thing, the curve of the hip, the eyebrow, and the moon. I don't know whether it's the crescent moon. Makes more sense perhaps if it's the crescent moon, but as all we have recorded is moon, not specifically crescent moon. The snake is interesting too. The snake is the one with the neck. Well, a snake's almost all neck, isn't it? There's no ending to a snake's neck. You've got the head and then you've got the neck, but where does the neck end? The platypus is duckbill. Now, wurrung, dulai is the duck part, and wurrung is the word for mouth or lips, and it also then becomes the word for language. So the language of the Melbourne area is Woiwurrung, and the language of the Goulburn Valley is Tungung Wurrung or Tungwurrung. And the first part means no, and Aboriginal people ask me about it. What's this no business? Well, it's like in English, we talked about the Nain people or the Nada people and so on. If we named languages in Europe by their word for no, the Nyet people and so on. So in Australia and in the southeast, many of the languages just take the word for no to be the distinguishing feature. So that's the Nada people, or that's the Non people, or that's the Nyet people, or whatever. The echidna is regularly known as the spine having one or the spike having one, and that makes sense, doesn't it? And once again, you can see that different languages look on it the same way and use their own words. So lik in Wadi Wadi up in the Swan Hill area, lik is the word for a spike or a spine, and will is the having suffix, and then the same suffix comes up in the Chapwarong language, and it comes up as gil in Gunditj Mara. Now, the koala is an interesting one. In the Wadi Wadi language, in Swan Hill, the word for koala is literally tree fork bottom. And when you get to the next language, Wemba Wemba, which is next door, you find tree fork bottom too, but with different words. I mean, the word for bottom happens to be the same, but Patjan is tree fork in Wadi Wadi, and Ngarambul is tree fork in Wemba Wemba. So they must both see the koala in terms of tree fork bottom. I don't know, I'm just guessing, but perhaps because that's the thing you most often see is the bottom sitting in the tree fork. And then in Chapwarong and Gunditj Mara, they call the koala well, to do with the ears. So one mob, the Chapwarong mob, talk about 2 ears, and the Gunditj Mara talk about having ears. And I suppose the ears are prominent, aren't they, on a koala? Now, when it comes to vocabulary, one of the things that people often comment on, usually adversely, that these people couldn't count. Well, they do count, but they don't have many counting words. So there are words for 1, for 2. The word for 3 is usually just 2 and 1. The word for 4 is 2 and 2. And the word for 5 is the word for hand. Just excuse me while I have a sip. They have words for plenty or many, but they do count, but they count on their body. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've left out 7 and 8 for some reason, I don't know why. 9 elbow, 10 bicep and 11 shoulder, and going up the body and down the other side, they get to over 30. Now, besides the normal language, they all have secret language, which you use in front of your mother-in-law. You cannot speak to your mother-in-law in an Aboriginal society. You can't have any dealings with your mother-in-law. For instance, you can't pass her anything directly. If you want to pass something to her, you have to put her down on the ground and she can pick it up. If she walks past, she's not supposed to see you. She's supposed to put her hand up like a blinker. And if you want to know whether she wants a piece of meat or something, you have to ask an intermediary to ask her whether she'd like a piece of meat or some bread or whatever. These secret languages are sort of codes. So if you have to speak in the presence of your mother-in-law, you have to use the secret code. And the secret code consists of about 300 or 400 words. So if you have different words for different kinds of lizard and goanna and so on, in the secret language there'll just be one lizard-type word. So it's a restricted vocabulary, but it must be used in the presence of a mother-in-law. Okay, we'll come now to the last part of the talk, the language survival, which is a big topic at the moment, and you probably come across references to this in newspapers fairly often nowadays. I mentioned there were about 250 completely separate languages, 750 or so if you count the dialects separately. Only about a dozen of those are still spoken and passed on to the next generation. Jumbaboingu in Arnhem Land, Pidgin in Central Australia, Walbury, Central Australia, and Tiwi spoken on the Tiwi Islands. Now, I've taken those figures from the web, but in the case of Tiwi, the language that's spoken nowadays is quite different from traditional Tiwi. It's been modified quite a bit by English. A few score of languages have a few speakers still, but nearly 200 are dead and are at present being reclaimed from 19th century records. In Victoria, there are some recordings of the last speakers made in the 1960s. There was a woman called Louise Schwarzschild, or she became Herkus when she married, a refugee from Nazi Germany, and she went around in the 1960s recording what could be recorded and was able to get quite a bit of material on Wemba Wemba, Swan Hill, Wergaya and the Wimmera, and Mati Mati at Piangle. Piangle is just downstream from Swan Hill. For the Melbourne language, Woiwurrung, she recorded about 100 words but no grammar. Now all the other sources for the languages of Victoria are from the 19th century, and these records present difficulties of interpretation because English had no consistent means of representing vowels, and letter U is the worst. It can be up as in but, U as in put, and U as in used. If you look at the materials, say you want the word for eagle, you can see all those spellings, the P-U-N-G-I-L, B-U-N-J-E-L and so on. And as I mentioned before, there's fluctuation between P and B, so that's why you get P and B spellings. Letter G, and wonder whether it's a hard G or a soft G. Well, you find a J in some versions, so it must be a soft J. And what about the letter U? Is that Punjul or Punjul? Well, eventually you find some double O spellings, so it must be Bunjul. And I get a bit annoyed when Aboriginal people sometimes say Bunjul, because it means it's not a true tradition. They're actually learning this stuff from written materials. Sometimes at Dreamtime of the G, for instance, you'll hear somebody talk about Bunjul and they say Bunjul. It should be Bunjul. Now, why they mention it, it's not just the word for eagle, it's the eagle ancestor, a leading Dreamtime figure, and it's one that Christian missionaries equated with God, and when they want to translate God, they usually use Bunjul Mama, which is Bunjul plus the word Mama, which is father. And you might be surprised that Mama is father, but Mama, if you go around the world's languages, Mama, Baba, Dada, and so on, come up with the meanings mother, father, aunt, and so on, but not consistently aligned. So they're based on the babbling or early syllables uttered by children. The word for white man is Ngamajik. Look at the spellings in the 19th century. You can see the initial NG, but then in the third spelling there, it's completely missed. And once again, is the G hard or soft? Well, there's some spellings with the J, so you decide that's Ngamajik. Now, my favourite example is this next one. Look at the first spelling of that last word, which means again or more. Letter U, NG. What would you make of that? Well, because you have other spellings, you can eventually work out it's yuang. So the first letter you take to be U as in usual, the second letter U as in but, and it's yuang. But it can be quite difficult to work out the pronunciation from the old records. Linguists then respell the words in a consistent way using the International Phonetic Alphabet values, which are the values of all the languages of the world except practically English. I mean, if you think of the words, whether they're Italian or Romanised, Japanese and so on, letter I will always be E and not I and so on. So nothing too surprising about that. A couple of mobs, though, use double O for U and so on. The people down in Warrnambool are using the double O spelling, as in Woolloomooloo. The trouble is, if you want to have a long oo and a short oo, you can't really write O, can you? So it's not a very good system. It's better to have a single letter for each vowel. So these things then get respelt, as I mentioned, and take the word for land or country, and the spellings there are shown on the left. You can see B-E-E-K, B-A-K and B-I-I-K. It'd be pretty obvious that the pronunciation was beak, and so that would get respelt in the IPA conventions as B-I-I-K. It comes up as in Nillumbik, the Shire out Eltham way, which means bad country. Strange choice, isn't it? Why would you call something bad country? And Nillumbik rather than Nillumbik, but that's not too bad. But recently, Moreland got renamed, as you probably know, and they call it Merrybeck. And I see an article in the paper where Aboriginals saying, well, what's this Merrybeck? I've never heard of either of those. Well, Merry is supposed to mean rocks, I think, but I know it only as the name of Merry Creek. I can't find it in the sources. And of all the spellings, they've chosen the odd one, the B-E-K one, which seems strange. Banyule means hill, and we have the city of Banyule. You can see the spellings there. Once again, the alternation between P and B, and I suppose the middle one, B-A-N-U-L-E, might be obscure, but you can see that it's Banyule from the spelling with the N-Y. And Yallock Creek gets disguised. Morty Yallock, for instance, is Murdy, and Yallock. Murt is short. Morty is what it becomes in a compound. You add a suffix E for the first word in the compound, and Murt plus Yallock, Morty Yallock is Short Creek, and Morty Yallock is I think Big Creek from memory. There's an indication of how much material is available for language revival in the southeast. So for the Warrnambool area, you have about 2,500 words, or for Central Victoria, about 2,500 words recorded, but for some of the other languages, only small numbers of words recorded. So what do you do when you have limitations in vocabulary? Well, you can extend the meaning of existing words, you can compose a new word by compounding or using a suffix, or you can borrow words from English or another Aboriginal language. So some of the extensions are fairly obvious. The word that means path or track is extended to mean road or street. The word for hut or camp is extended to cover house or home. The word for lightning is extended to cover electricity, and the word for thunder is extended to cover gun. As I mentioned, you can make up words using compounding or using suffixes or something like that. In the South Australia, in the Mount Gambier area, they've taken the word bungle doctor and tunga tooth to make up dentist. Tooth doctor, that's a fairly obvious one, but not so obvious as the next one. They've taken pungle doctor and moola camp and joined the two together in a blend, like we do with brunch and smog and so on, give Pangula the local health centre. To give an example using a suffix, Jerang is the word for leg, and in the Woiwurrung, and there's a suffix alak, which means having to do with, so something having to do with the leg, trousers, and Jinang foot Jinanguluk is footwear, something to do with the foot. Words can be borrowed and have been borrowed from English over a period of time, and the word for dinner, for instance, is borrowed from English, and it refers to the meal in the middle of the day. And of course, I remember as a kid, you probably can too, remember we talked about Sunday dinner, you'd have a roast for Sunday dinner. Nowadays, of course, we use dinner for the evening meal, but the older usage survives in Aboriginal usage. In fact, quite a lot. The word gammon, for instance, is common in Aboriginal talk nowadays, but it's more or less dropped out of our talk. I can remember my grandmother using it, but it's not used nowadays among white fellows. And the word gown is borrowed for dress. And once again, dress is a common word nowadays, but we wouldn't use gown for the average dress that you'd wear during the day. Now, some of the tricky ones, the word in Western Desert for hem is doubler. It's the word double, because the hem is the doubled over bit, isn't it, of the material. And the word for chain is based on handcuffs, but it gets rather disguised. There's no H, so it comes out as the N's okay, but we drop the D anyway. The K of cuffs is okay. The F comes out as a P, and then you have to have another vowel because the word can't end in a P. So runkapu. But once it's borrowed, the next generation wouldn't see any resemblance between that and handcuffs. And then in Arunta, the word for matches is based on Lucifer, and you can see how the S has come out as a T, and the F has come out as a P. And Lucifer was a brand of matches, I think, are no longer around. Now, what happens with this language revival? What do people do? Well, they love composing and delivering a welcome to country, and of course they get paid for it too, which is an incentive, I guess. They like to compose and deliver formal addresses. They translate into language traditional stories recorded in English. They translate English nursery rhymes and songs into language. They supply native names as alternatives for English place names. They supply Aboriginal names for properties in response to requests. And they supply meanings for Aboriginal place names. Puckapunyal. Puckapunyal has the Banyul word as the second part, as Hill is a bit uncertain as to what the Pucka part actually does mean. There's a move nowadays to introduce Aboriginal languages in school, and it's very widespread to have Aboriginal language in primary school, concentrated in the early years of primary school. It involves fun games, singing songs, and all students are taught the language. Now, in areas outside Victoria, Aboriginal children outnumber the non-Aboriginal, but typically in Victoria, the non-Aboriginal children outnumber those who identify as Aboriginal. There's a national curriculum outline for Indigenous languages that covers all years up to year 12. So there's a scheme of how the language should be introduced, how the culture should be introduced, and you insert into the template whatever language you want to use. Now, that would make sense for languages where the culture is still around and the language is strong, Pidgin, Tjara, Arunta, Mirranbutta, Tiwi perhaps, but it's hardly feasible where a language is revived from limited materials. It's not like learning French where you can go to France, or learning Indonesian where you can go to Indonesia. You cannot travel to a country where the language is spoken effectively. I mean, I know you can go to Alice Springs and so on, but it's not. You can't really go to an area where you need to speak the language and can use the language to interact with the culture. And there's very little in the way of literature available. Problem too in reviving the language is that the speakers are scattered. For instance, the Watawurrung people have a centre in Geelong and one in Ballarat. Grammar is difficult and is pretty dull, really. I mean, did anybody enjoy learning Latin grammar or French grammar? It's not a lot of fun. The end product might be fun, but not the actual grammar. The vocabulary and grammar are incomplete. Imagine a Latin grammar which might be 250 pages. Imagine if it's been in a fire and you've got only 50 pages left. Well, that's really what you've got with the grammar in the southeast. You've got this incomplete grammar. There's also problems of attitude. Older people don't like younger people knowing more than they do, and they consider language a private possession not to be shared. This applies to vocabulary, not to structure. Nobody worries about grammar, but they have ownership when it comes to words. And some Aboriginal people want to keep the language to themselves. They don't want it taught outside the community, a problem if a language is to be introduced into school. And some of them don't want outsiders teaching the language. Well, there we might finish. That's my last slide when I give you the southern end of the Grampians, Mount Sturgeon and Mount Abrupt. And they are seen as the noses of giants lying on their back, and they're the noses pointing up. And that's another interesting thing I haven't got time to talk about today. If you go around the place names, there's some interest to be had in analysing the meaning of the place names. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Barry, are you happy to take a couple of questions if there's
sure,
some questions? Any questions? Yeah, thanks.
Barry, I'd just like to know, given the common possession thing with the Aborigines, and like everybody's common, but well, from what we understand, Europeans, they have common possession of all sorts of things. Do all the Aboriginal peoples of the various tribes have words for please and thank you? I've never saw anything on
No, I've never come across please or thank you, no.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Barry, I'm just wondering, you're learning and very interested in language and Aboriginal languages. When you talk to Aboriginal people, are they very comfortable with you learning their language, or do they think that's something that's really their property and they should be learning?
Look, I started 50 years ago, and all these attitudes didn't exist. They were quite happy for me to learn their language. And although at that time we talked a bit about it being useful for future generations, basically it was the white fella, collecting it for himself. The people would be willingly recorded. I've never came across a case where they were unwilling to be recorded. It's only in the modern context where we have these old records that, and people no longer know the language, that these attitudes come up of keeping it to ourselves and older people not wanting younger people to know more than they do.
Yeah. Please.
Is there much intermarriage between people of different tribes?
Yes, there always was, and the woman's the one who had to move usually, and all Aboriginal people were multilingual, and that would be part of it. I mean, you grow up with a mother speaking a different language from the father. Yes, it was intermarriage between tribes was common, between neighbouring tribes, yes. They travelled fair distances. I mean, if you read the early records of Melbourne, the people in the Goulburn Valley were commonly in Melbourne. Imagine walking, from north of the Great Divide to Melbourne. It's a fair walk, isn't it? But they did it, yeah.
Anybody else? Barry, can I ask you, is there a reasoning behind, you talked about the forbidden, the taboo in relation to mothers-in-law and such. Is there reasoning behind that?
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, look, in our society, mother-in-laws have a certain place in our culture. We have jokes about staying like a mother-in-law and cold as the mother-in-law's kiss and so on. Not so common nowadays. But, I mean, there's a problem with the mother-in-law, isn't there? Because there's a conflict for the woman. She's got loyalty to her mother and then loyalty to the husband, and then the husband's likely to resent the influence of the wife's mother on his wife. And I think it's just a universal thing, but obviously seen as a bigger problem in Aboriginal society, and they've taken means to eliminate the problem.
That seems very effective. All right then, so unless there's any other questions, Barry, thank you so much for your presentation today. Very informative, certainly opened my eyes a bit. And on behalf of the club, thank you for coming along today.
Oh, thank you.
Take that as